დღეს ჩვენ ხსნით საზაფხულო სკოლას, რომლის სახელია კონსტიტუციური სამართალი და საჯარო პოლიტიკა, ადამიანის უფლებები თეორიასა და პრაქტიკაში. ეს არის სამართლის სკოლის საზაფხულო სკოლა და ჩვენ წელს ხსნით მის მე-11 სეზონს. და თუ გავითვალისწინებთ, რომ უნივერსიტეტი სულ 12 წლისაა, ის ალბათ ერთ-ერთი ყველაზე ხანგრძლივი ტრადიცია, რომელიც ამ უნივერსიტეტში მოგდევს. ეს არის ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანი სკოლა, რომლის მიზანია მომავალი იურისტების ცოდნის ამაღლება საკონსტიტუციო და ადამიანის უფლებებში და მე მინდა ვთქვა, რომ ჩვენ წელს გაისად იმის შემდეგაც აღნიშნავთ ჩვენი პირველი რესპუბლიკის 100 წელს და სულ გვაქვს ის განცდა ნებისმიერ სპეციალისტ თუ არასპეციალისტ, რომ ის კონსტიტუცია, რომელიც მე-20 საუკუნეში პირველად შეიქმნა 20-იან წლებში, იყო შეუდარებლად უკეთესი, ვიდრე ის კონსტიტუცია, რომელიც დაწერა ჩვენ მოახერხეთ 90-იანებში და ერთ-ერთი მიზეზი როგორც ჩანს მაინც ის იყო, რომ საბჭოთა კავშირი ბევრად უფრო დამაზიანებელი აღმოჩნდა თავისუფლების ინფრასტრუქტურისათვის, ვიდრე თუნდაც ისეთი რეპრესიული რეჟიმი, როგორც მეფის რუსეთი იყო, ხო, რაც არ უნდა უცნაურად ჟღერდეს, მაგრამ ასეა. ამიტომაც განსაკუთრებული ყურადღება საკონსტიტუციო და კონსტიტუციური და ადამიანის უფლებების მიმართ არის სრულად გამართლებული და მე ვერ წარმომიდგენია უკეთესი დასაწყისი ამ სკოლისათვის, ვიდრე პროფესორ ანდრაშ შაიოს ლექცია. პროფესორი შაიო არის სოფლიოში სრულად განთქმული და წამყვანი სპეციალისტი კონსტიტუციური სამართლისა და რაც არანაკლებ მნიშვნელოვანია საქართველოშიც ასევე განთქმული და წამყვანი ეს თაობებია პრინციპში ქართველი იურისტების, რომლებიც აღიზარდნენ პროფესორ შაიოს სახელმძღვანელოებზე და გამოკვლევებზე ან მის მიერ ცენტრალური ევროპის უნივერსიტეტში და მისი სახელი ძალიან კარგად არის ცნობილი ჩვენთვის. სწორედ ამიტომ გადავწყვეტთ, რომ ეს დასაწყისი ასევე ყოფილიყო საჯარო ტიპის ღონისძიება და დარწმუნებული ვიყავით, რომ ინტერესი იქნებოდა დიდი და ჩვენ ხედავთ სემესტრის დასრულების შემდეგ საფხულის ძალიან ცხელ დღეს, რომ ეს ინტერესი მართლაც ასეა, არ არსებობს და მე სულაც არ მიგვირს ეს. პროფესორ შაიოს მოღვაწეობის შესახებ კიდევ იქნება დღეს საუბარი, მეტიც მე ცოტა იყო სასპენსივით ვიტყვი, რომ ლექციის შემდგომ ჩვენ მცირე ცერემონიასაც ჩავატარებთ, რათა ეს ღვაწლი ცოტათი მაინც აღვნიშნოთ. ახლა კი მე მინდა განსაკუთრებული მადლობა უთხრა იმ ორგანიზაციებს, რომელთა ფინანსური დახმარებითაც ტარდება საზაფხულო სკოლა და ჩვენ მათ წარმომადგენლებს ახლა ვთხოვთ სიტყვის წარმოსათქმელად მისასალმებელი სიტყვისათვის ამ ტრიბუნასთან, მაგრამ მანამდე ასევე მინდა განსაკუთრებული მადლობა გადაუხადო ორ ადამიანს, ორგანიზაციულ ინტელექტუალური ასე ვთქვათ ადმინისტრების ამ პროცესის. ერთი არის ბატონი ირაკლი ფორჩხიძე, რომელიც გახლავთ სამართლის სკოლის დეკანი და ბატონი კოტე ვარძელაშვილი, რომელიც არის ამავე სკოლის პროფესორი, მართლაც აი მათი ძალისხმევის შედეგია დღევანდელი ღონისძიება და მადლობა მათ. მე კი თითოეულ სკოლის წევრს გისურვებ ძალიან საინტერესო მომავალ კვირებს და დარწმუნებული ვარ, რომ მსმენელები პროფესორ შაიოს ლექციისა ძალიან დიდი ასევე ინტერესით გავატარებ დღევანდელ საღამოს. მადლობა.
დიდი მადლობა ბატონო გიგა, მეც მოგესალმებით. ბატონო გიგა მახსენია, რომ უკვე 11 ძალიან დიდი ხანია 11 წელია როგორც საზაფხულო სკოლა პროექტში არის ჩართული ელიას სახელმწიფო უნივერსიტეტი, ახორციელებს ამ პროექტს. ეს მისთვის მნიშვნელოვანი პროექტი იყო და ამ პროექტის გახორციელება შეუძლებელი იქნებოდა, რომ არა ჩვენი დიდი ხნის მეგობრების და პარტნიორების დახმარება ამ წლების განმავლობაში. მე მინდა მათ წარმომადგენლებს ვთხოვ, პირველ ყოვლისა ბატონ ვლადიმერ შკოლნიკოვს, გაეროს ადამიანის უფლებათა უმაღლესი კომისრის წარმომადგენელ სამხრეთ კავკასიაში, მოგმართოს ორივე სიტყვით. ვთხოვთ.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and it's my pleasure to be opening on behalf of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights this summer school on constitutional law and public policy emphasizing theory and practice of human rights, which is, of course, organized by Ilia State University, and I would like to thank the organizers. I would like to thank other donors, Open Society Georgia Foundation, GIZ Rule of Law Program, East West Management Institute Prologue Program, for also contributing and making this school possible. And I would like to warmly thank distinguished lecturers who came from outside of Georgia and agreed to participate in this event. Your travel and your dedication and your time is very much appreciated. I'd like to warmly thank all of you, especially those of you who fully participate in the summer school. It's our hope that it's not only useful to you, but it's also enjoyable. Our office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has always stressed the importance of constitutions that reflect international human rights standards enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 70 years of which we're commemorating this year. And also we always stress that as much as possible the constitutions should also reflect the principles of the International Human Rights Conventions. Rulings of constitutional courts are also important and critical, especially when such rulings serve to uphold international human rights standards, when they address issues such as discrimination, right to fair trial, freedoms of peaceful assembly, of association, of expression. Our office has been carrying out various programs in Georgia. We'll be doing quite a few things leading up to December 10th, which is the International Human Rights Day, and when we celebrate 70 years of the Universal Declaration. And I hope that you will be able to join some of these events as they're held in various universities. I'd like to especially thank Mr. Verzelashvili for playing a key role in organizing this event, but also for thanking him for his long service in the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which is a committee that looks at the implementation by states members of the UN of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and issues various important decisions and comments dealing with civil and political rights. And Mr. Verzelashvili played a very strong role in the committee during the time of his service. So again, hope that this is both enjoyable and useful, and that some of you will be applying to the UN Human Rights Office for jobs in some time when you're finished with your studies, and we would welcome you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ეხამიდავთ ხო USAID-ის პროექტის ისეს მანაჯმენტის პროლოგის წარმომადგენლებს, ასევე ქალბატონ მარიამ ვარდოსანიძეს, მოგმართოს ორივე სიტყვით.
მოგესალმებით ყველას. პირველ რიგში დიდი მადლობა მინდა უნივერსიტეტს, ილიას უნივერსიტეტს გადაუხადო, რადგანაც მან ორგანიზება გაუწია ესეთ საინტერესო ღონისძიებას. და მადლობა ასევე სტუდენტებს. ჩვენი პროექტის ერთ-ერთი მიზანი არის განათლების, იურიდიული განათლების მიმართულების ხელშეწყობა, განსაკუთრებით ინტერაქტიული მეთოდების დანერგვა და მათი ამ მეთოდების გამოყენებით სწავლების ხელშეწყობა უნივერსიტეტებში და ზოგადად საქართველოში. ეს საზაფხულო სკოლა სწორედ ამ მიზანს ემსახურება. ძალიან მიხარია, რომ ამდენს გხედავთ. დიდი მადლობა კიდევ ერთხელ ყველას, ვინც კი მონაწილეობას იღებს ამ საზაფხულო სკოლაში. მადლობთ.
დიდი მადლობა. სანამ პროფესორ შაიოს მისცემ შესაძლებლობას, რომ დაიწყოს გამოვიდეს და თავისი საჯარო ლექციით, შევეცდები პროფესორ შაიოს არ ჭირდება წარდგინება. პრინციპში და არც ამ აუდიტორიაში, არც მის ფარგლებს გარეთ თავისთავად ის გარემოება, რომ ჩვენ მოგვიწია ლიგამუსის საკმაოდ ყუდრო პატარა დარბაზის შეცვლა უფრო დიდი ტევადობის დარბაზზე მიუთითებს იმაზე, რომ თუ რამხელა დიდი არის ინტერესი ამ ლექციისადმი და რამდენიმე დიდია ცნობადობა პროფესორ შაიოსი, თუმცა მიუხედავად ამისა, ან შეიძლება ითქვას სწორედ იმიტომაც, რომ ინტერესი ეს დიდი არის და აუდიტორია საკმაოდ დიდია, მე მინდა ორიოდე სიტყვით მაინც პროფესორ შაიოს შესახებ ვისაუბროთ და ამის გაკეთება მინდა ვთხოვო მის ერთ-ერთ სტუდენტს, ყოფილ სტუდენტს, რა თქმა უნდა, რომელსაც ჩვენ ვიცნობთ არა მხოლოდ იმიტომ, რომ ის პროფესორ შაიოს სტუდენტი იყო, ბატონო გიორგი პაპუაშვილს თხოვ ორიოდე სიტყვით გამოვიდეს.
მივესალმებ ბატონ ანდრაშს, მის მეუღლეს აგნეშას, რომელიც აქ ზის. მადლობა, რომ დაგვთანხმდა კიდევ ერთხელ და ჩამობრძანდა საქართველოში. ამჟამად უკვე საზაფხულო სკოლაში მონაწილეობის მისაღებად ჩვენ დიდი ხნის თანამშრომლობა გვაქვს თავისთავად და საკმაოდ ცნობილი არის საქართველოში. ბატონი ავთანდილი იხსენებდა, რომ 25 წლის წინ, როდესაც კონსტიტუციაზე მიდიოდა მუშაობა, ბატონი ანდრაში იყო ჩართული და ჩვენი ექსპერტების და კომისიის ხელმძღვანელობას და წევრებით თბილისში, ბუდაპეშტში, ჩიკაგოში, სწორედ მასთან ერთად ის სხვა ექსპერტები, როგორიც იყვნენ ცნობილი ჰერმან შვარცი, ლარი ლესიგი, ბლანკენაგენი, სწორედ ისინი ეხმარებოდნენ ჩვენს კანონმდებლებსა და იურისტებს იმ კონსტიტუციის შექმნაში და თავიანთ მოსაზრებებში. იმედია, დიდი ნაწილი გათვალისწინებულია, მაგრამ რაც არ იყო გათვალისწინებული, იმას მოუწია მე ერთ-სამჯერ გადახედვა, მაგრამ ყოველ შემთხვევაში შეიძლება უარესიც ყოფილიყო. ამიტომ ამაზეც დიდი მადლობა ბატონ ანდრაშ და სხვებსაც. ამიტომ როდესაც მომიწია სწავლა სულ რამდენიმე წლის წინ, ახლა ძალიან დიდი ხნის წინაც არ გვინდა ცენტრალურ უნივერსიტეტში, მე სხვა ვსწავლობდი და ავიღე როგორც დამატებითი საგნები და ოღონდ არ მქონდა კრედიტები. ამიტომ ძალიან თავისუფალ რეჟიმში ვიყავი და ვაკვირდებოდი სტუდენტებსაც, იმიტომ რომ საწყალე სტუდენტები გაწურულები იყვნენ, შეშინებულები და ყოველთვის ნერვიულობდნენ და პასუხისმგებლობით ეკიდებოდნენ, რა თქმა უნდა, ბატონი ანდრაშის საგნებს. მე რადგან ნიშნებს არ ველოდებოდი, უბრალოდ ცოდნისთვის ვიდოდა და კონკრეტული პრაქტიკული მიზანი იყო, შესაძლოა მქონდა ასე ვთქვათ, დავკვირვებოდი ამ პროცესს და რა დიდი ცოდნით და რა დიდი პასუხისმგებლობით მოდიოდნენ მე სტუდენტები ამ ლექციებიდან. პირველი თაობა ჯერ კიდევ იყო 25 წელზე მეტი ხნის განმავლობაში წინ, როდესაც ბატონი ზაზა ნამურაძე და სხვები სწავლობდნენ, მე კიდე სხვა თაობები და ეხლაც უკვე 25 წელია, ეხლა ცენტრალურ უნივერსიტეტში ქართველი სტუდენტები დიდი სიამოვნებით მიდიან, რომ იურიდიულ ფაკულტეტზე ეზიარონ ცოდნას. ამიტომ უკვე ბატონ შაიოს ის იმდენად ცნობილი იყო, რომ დიდი მოთხოვნა იყო მის ლექციებზე მოხვედრისა და დასწრების. ამასთანავე, როდესაც იგი შეუერთდა ევროპის ადამიანის უფლებათა სასამართლოს, იგი უკვე საკმაოდ დიდი ცნობილი მეცნიერი იყო და არ მგონია, რომ ამ თვითონ მოსამართლეს გახდომამ მის სახელს კიდე დამატებით რაღაცა ჩვენს რეგიონში სახელი შეძინა, მაგრამ რა თქმა უნდა ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანი იყო, იმიტომ რომ ის ცოდნა და გამოცდილება, როგორც თეორიული, ასევე პრაქტიკული, რაც მას გააჩნდა, მე შესაძლებლობა მიეცა მას, რომ გამოეხატა იმ გადაწყვეტილებში, სადაც ის მონაწილეობდა, როგორც ძირითად მოხსენებელი, ასევე მას აქვს რამდენიმე საინტერესო განსხვავებული და თანხმოვანი აზრიც, რა თქმა უნდა, ქართულ საქმეებს აღარ ვახსენებ და მან თავისი კვალი მართლაც დაამჩნია იმ სასამართლოში თავიანთი საქმიანობით, მას ყოველთვის ჰქონდა თავისი ხედვები, შედარებით კონსტიტუციონალისტის პერსპექტივებიდან, ასევე იმ გამოწვევებიდან, რაც ახასიათებს თანამედროვე კონსტიტუციონალიზმის პრობლემებს და მიუხედავად ამდენი ხნის უკვე გასვლისა თითქოს რაც ჩვენს რეგიონში ტრანსფორმაციები დაიწყო, ეს გამოწვევები კიდევ სახეზეა და დღეს სწორედ ამ თემაზე გვექნება საუბარი. ამასთანავე მისი წიგნები და სტატიები საქართველოშიდაც საკმაოდ პოპულარობით სარგებლობს. იცით რომ ნათარგმნი არის ხელისუფლების თვითშეზღუდვა ქართულად, რომელიც ბევრმა უნივერსიტეტმა თავის სილაბუსებში შეიტანა რაღაცა ნაწილები. ჩვენს ჟურნალში სამართლის კონსტიტუციურ სამართლის მიმოხილვაშიც, რომელშიც მან ასე ვთქვათ, ორი სტატია გამოაქვეყნა, ერთი შეეხებოდა სეკულარიზმს და კონსტიტუციას და მეორე ეგრეთ წოდებული მილიტანტ დემოკრატია, ანუ ბრძოლისუნარიანი დემოკრატია, რომელიც გამოიცა 12 წლის წინ, მაგრამ მე მგონი ეხლაც აქტუალური არის და სამწუხაროდ შეიძლება უახლოეს წლებში კიდევ აქტუალურ საკითხად დაგვრჩეს, ამიტომ მე მგონი ამოღება მოგვიწევს იმ სტატიის გახსენება, რომ რა პოსტულატები არის შიგნით. და ახლახანს კიდევ ახალი წიგნი გამოიცა მისი ავტორობით კონსტიტუციის თავისუფლება ქართულად ალბათ ესე ითარგმნება და მე იმაქვს რომ ჩვენი უნივერსიტეტისა და ჩვენი პარტნიორების ხარდაჭერა და ბატონი ანდრაშ შაიოს ანდრაშ წინასწარი თანხმობით საკმაოდ მოცულობითია, მაგრამ ისი ქართულად თარგმანიც უახლოეს ხანში დაიწყება და ისე ასევე გამოადგება არა მარტო სტუდენტებს, არამედ იურიდიულ საზოგადოებას მთლიანად და საინტერესო იქნება მისი შეხედულები ამ საკითხებთან დაკავშირებითაც. კიდევ ერთხელ დიდი მადლობა, გადავუხადო ეს დღეები თბილისში და შემდეგ სტეფანწმინდაში ჩვენ სტუდენტებთან ერთად იქნება საშუალება რომ კიდევ გააგრძელოს საქმიანობა, ასევე მინდა მადლობა გადავუხადო ქალბატონ ნონა წოზორიას, მის ყოფილ კოლეგას სტრასბურგის სასამართლოდან, რომელიც ასევე დაგვთანხმდა და წაიკითხავს ლექციებს, ისიც ესე ვთქვათ, ახალი მახსოვრობით სტრასბურგის საქმეებთან დაკავშირებით. მე მგონი უნიკალური საშუალება აქვს ჩვენ საზაფხულო სკოლის მონაწილეებს, რომ ორი ყოფილი მოსამართლე სტრასბურგის სასამართლოში ცოცხლად ყავდეთ და გამოკითხონ ყველაზე აქტუალურ თეორიულ, არა მარტო თეორიულ, არამედ პრაქტიკულ ასპექტებზე სტრასბურგში მიმდინარე საქმეებთან დაკავშირებით. დიდი მადლობა.
Esteemed rector, dear colleagues, and of course by colleagues I definitely include students, so I will not specifically mention students. I would like to thank very much George Papadashvili for his kind word or words. Indeed, my deep relations with Georgia go back to many, many years, and maybe it will be of interest if I make a disclosure at the beginning. I think this will be hopefully funny because the rest of my lecture is rather sad. So the funny story I have to tell you is about the Constitution. There was a team of experts trying to develop, to contribute. There was also a lot of political, how to put it, goodwill hunting. The result of our work was, I think, quite good, and it was very well received by the then political leadership, and indeed I think that most of our suggestions were accepted, so if I were able to read in Georgian, I would find it there, except one small thing, and that's the legal history part, that compared to our version, was a small change that most of the places where the word parliament was present, it was replaced by president. But the rest, that was our work. So that was the legal history part, and now the lecture will be about not history but future. But it will be about a future that I am afraid is not as bright as legal history would be. And I apologize for this. It will be a lecture that will be rather sad, and I think it's honest. You may feel at certain points some kind of depression. You may feel discouraged. But I think that it's extremely important to be confronted with the reality of constitutionalism, or the realities of the future of constitutionalism and human rights, exactly in order to be able to respond to this challenge. So I would like to say at the very beginning, and I will conclude on this, if I don't conclude on this, please remind me that whatever I say is not in a way self-fulfilling, not intended to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it is, notwithstanding all the odds, a possibility, if you take values seriously, to resist this kind of emerging destiny. So the topic of the lecture is basically illiberal democracy, especially in Central Europe, and the future of human rights in that context. And I will show tonight that internal weaknesses in constitutional structures and the abuse of democratic constitutionalism resulted in a contemporary threat of perpetuation of governmental power. This is not limited to East Central Europe, it's not limited to Hungary or Poland or less often mentioned states like Romania or these days very often mentioned states like Italy. It is something that goes on in Europe and it goes on in many other parts of the world. And I think this is not a lecture in geography, so I will not name other countries. Why we have this difficulty, that's a social and economic question I am not qualified to answer, but I can bet that it is partly due to the unfinished nature of the constitutional project. Constitutions are full of theoretically unjustified compromises and gaps, and what is happening today from the legal perspective is using and abusing those gaps in the Constitution. So to give you one example to make this understandable, most constitutions do not limit the number of Supreme Court justices. So legislation may add an infinite number of new judges, may create new positions and fill those positions. And that's the end of constitutional review. By the way, this most honorable tradition was something that was, among others, invented by President Roosevelt in the United States, and the Supreme Court of the United States during the economic crisis of the 30s tried to resist his plans. He said, okay, I have majority enough, and I will add new judges, and I will vote in favor of the new legislation. There was a lot of resistance in the Senate, so it was very unlikely that he will be able to push it through. But anyway, he was not forced to do that because one justice passed away and the other changed his mind, and then there was a new majority. Now this trick that the number of judges is not fixed in a constitution, for example, and that the specific provision is not specifically entrenched, so you need a very special procedure to change it. That possibility was used in a number of countries when major changes occurred, including Hungary, where new positions were created and filled by the government. And something similar, not exactly the same, happened in Poland. There are many other ways to influence a constitutional court, but this is the simplest one, and it shows that a technical shortcoming may help to undermine constitutional democracy. Now, what is really the constitutional problem of our time? It is, in a way, a paradox that we are confronted with. Democracy is one of the greatest threats to democracy. Democratic means can be used to obtain power, that is to say, control over the state, and then that power is used to destroy democracy. And this is really the problem with populism. Populism and populist parties threaten constitutional democracy by first coming to power democratically through elections, and then perpetuate power again through continued elections, but those elections do not enable a genuine democracy, and most often these are carried out perhaps freely, although that is also questionable, but certainly not fairly. And the result is illiberal democracy, and that illiberal democracy turns into despotism within democracy. You have the walls of the democracy, but inside there is no democracy, but something else. And that means, in practical terms, that all the fundamental constituent elements of constitutional democracy are destroyed. There will be only formal separation of powers. There will be only formal democratic decision-making. There will be no genuine democratic accountability. This will be gone, and it is going away, and again, not only in Eastern Central Europe. So, this is really the problem that I would like to discuss a little bit with you. I would like to add something about the terminology. I use the term illiberal democracy, and some people say that this is an oxymoron, it's a nonsense. There are better terms. Perhaps that criticism is correct. A democracy cannot be illiberal. It has to be liberal in a sense, respecting fundamental rights and fundamental liberal values, freedom of speech, etc. The reason I use the term is very simple, because this is the term used by the very people who create this new regime. This term was used by the current Prime Minister of Mr. Orban, of Hungary, Mr. Orban, and he is of the view that it is time to end liberalism. Liberalism is not good. People don't like it, don't need it, and we have to create an illiberal democracy. And he got sufficient votes 3 times in a row to carry out that promise. Now, there is a problem with illiberal democracy, which makes it very difficult to criticize and very difficult to resist. Illiberal democracies come to power through democratic means, and they can claim that they are endorsed by the people. Now, what these illiberal democracy leaders mean by the people? They mean the majority who is supporting them. If you look at data, this is most often not a genuine majority of the citizens. It is a relative majority of those who participate at the elections, and then because of distortions in the electoral system, that yields a majority or even supermajority. But that's not the key issue, even if these were the majority of all citizens. That is not a good enough reason to disregard the rest of the society or to disregard fundamental institutional agreements of society. Because if you accept that the majority, a genuine majority, has that power, that means that you completely deny the existence of a minority. You just deny. The easiest thing would be to say, okay, those who vote for Mr. X or Mrs. X, they can stay in the country and the others should go. That's basically what this kind of reasoning would entail. The second problem with why illiberal democracy is not a democracy is that a democracy has some kind of substantive values which then result in the respect of liberal values. Again, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and autonomy of institutions and individuals. And that, what presupposes this is that there is a social, political process of deliberation, that people, all people, have a certain, at least theoretical possibility to participate, to make their views known, and make politicians be responsive to that. Now, if you don't allow a rational discourse of this sort, that kind of democracy has no real value. Then it will become a process of selecting leaders who will tell you what to do. That's not exactly what a state based on freedom is about. That you can choose someone to tell you how to be a slave, because that's what follows from this logic. The democracy of populism is based, this is a quote, on an indigenous unreasonability arising within native or nativist constituencies. So in other words, instead of having autonomous individuals, you have nativist people, people who believe that their only form of existence is within a community which is preformed by the leader. It is the leader who tells what kind of community you need. And so here we get to the heart of this new form of ruling, of government. And that new form is something that was already exactly 100 years ago described by a great German sociologist, politician, Max Weber. Max Weber, at the end of World War I, was confronted, like his fellow Germans, with the loss of the Kaiser, the emperor, the end of the war. They had to create a new republic. But the Germans were accustomed to have an emperor. So how to replace the emperor? That was his problem. And his solution, and he was very much in favor of this, and you will see under which presuppositions. He was very much in favor of what he called Caesarism. So Caesar, the Roman, Julius Caesar. So a kind of rule that reminds one of Julius Caesar. And what was the basis of power for Julius Caesar? That was a constant popular support, constant popular acclamation. So the leader is a leader as long as people are supporting him. And in a way, this is exactly what happens. You have a very personalized rule, a single ruler. It can be a president, it can be a prime minister, it can be someone who sits in the back seat, like in Poland, Kaczynski, who is not a prime minister, but he runs the show. So it's a personal rule, which is very strange in a democracy. And the personal rule is in need of constant popular support by expressing support at elections, at plebiscite, referendum, etc., etc. Or, again, it's a Hungarian example, the government, for an incredible amount of money, sends from time to time a letter to all citizens, and they ask, do you agree with what we intend to do with the migrants? And then you can send it back. You don't have to pay for the letter to be returned, so it's franchised. And then you say yes. And then the government says, you see, the government is supported by 83% of the population. No one knows, of course, how many letters were sent back or what is in those letters, but 83% is supporting it. So there is a constant need and a constant possibility to feel reinforced. And that's the way this kind of personal rule operates. There is a second level of operation, why this is in a democracy a personal rule, that the power depends on personal relations. So institutions don't matter. You replace the judges, you replace the president of the central bank, you replace this and that, you replace everyone with loyal cadres, and those guys will apply the law. The law is also very much changed in favor of the government, but everything will be a matter of personal loyalty, and that kind of loyalty goes from the top to the bottom. And that's how this system really works. And the law around it is secondary. Personal loyalty matters. And it's still called, rightly by former standards, a democracy. Now let me go back to Max Weber. This is a quote from him. The Caesaristic leader responds to his electorate's psychic, physical, economic, ethical, religious, or political needs. He knows no supervisory or appeals body, no technical jurisdiction. And that's his definition. Now, as I hinted to it, he was in favor, he found that it's acceptable. And indeed, his draft to the German Constitution, which was to some extent accepted, reflected these ideas. So the way in the Weimar Republic, the president of the Republic, the Reichspräsident, acted was based on this idea, which has terrible consequences because it was the unchecked Reichspräsident who gave then a mandate to Hitler. So was Weber wrong? Maybe he was, but at least he had certain assumptions, which in a modern illiberal democracy are not satisfied. So what he said was that in a Caesaristic system, there are countervailing forces. It's funny because I mentioned Germany, but his model is England, and rightly so. He thought that the prime minister is a Caesaristic rule. Now, standard English textbooks talk about prime ministerial dictatorship. So he was right. But he said, that's not the end of the world because there are limits coming from parliamentarism. I quote, vis-à-vis the factually Caesarist representative of the masses, that is to say parliament, there are safeguards in England. One, the continuity. Two, and the supervision of his power position, and the preservation of civil rights, and a suitable political proving ground of the politicians, wooing the confidence of the masses, and finally, the peaceful elimination of the Caesarist dictator once he had lost the trust of the masses. Now, none of these five conditions is satisfied under current circumstances. Parliament is not exercising control. Or if you take the United States, the modern form of executive presidentialism, Congress has practically no control over the president. There's a long history behind it. Was not, by the way, today it's attributed to President Trump. It was Obama who technically led the United States to that point. So no control. So one-man rule, the need of constant democratic reassertion, and a person who believes that he has to keep the power. That's what you have. And this is what makes it imperative to make power perpetual. If you lose power, the consequences are unacceptable for those who used and abused power. And therefore, contrary to the constitutional system that we know, here everything is a formality. You will never allow, or you do everything to prevent an election to bring in a new government. Now, what are the consequences of this and how you create that power? This is the new constitutionalism, if you wish. It has nothing to do with constitutionalism, of course. So the main technique is abusing the rule of law. You have formally a very legalistic situation, but the parliament, which became a factory for lawmaking, creates laws which allow all sorts of tricks. So everything is legal, but what you legalize is the abuse. Let me give you one simple example. And I hope that this, I guess this doesn't exist here, so it may sound, it's not a suggestion, it's just a warning. So for example, in Hungary, or Romania, a lot of money goes through the government because most of the public works are sponsored by the European Union. The European Union requires procurement, public bid. You know, that's a fair, transparent process. Now what you do, you write the procurement law in a way that grants the authorities all sorts of otherwise reasonable exceptions. So something will be a matter of national security interest. So the huge parking garage, which allegedly was needed for parliament in Hungary, this is not going through the ordinary procurement process because it's national security, the garage, okay. And then, instead of making this public, you can have just 3 companies who are invited to the bid. And it's up to the authority to determine who these 3 companies are. Or they can create criteria which determine in advance who will be the winner. And if that doesn't work, then if some stupid guy still wants to submit a bid, they will say, this is too low, it's not serious, so you are excluded. We take only serious offers. And, you know, it will be tailored, and everything will be according to the law. Of course, you need a procurement office that is already selected, so they will know which guy is the one that has to win the bid, or in which circumstances you have to create specific criteria and for whom. So everything is legal and nothing is lawful. That's basically the idea here. Imagine that with criminal law. We are not yet there except in a few areas, but it is moving in that direction. Italy already in 3 weeks created an incredible mess in a strange administrative interpretation of criminal law regarding those who have to do something with migrants. Let me turn to the human rights aspects of this. So is this having an impact on human rights? Yes and no. There is a problem with human rights, but I must say that this is not originating primarily from these illiberal democracies. Illiberal democracies just abuse an international process where human rights are less and less respected in substance. Formally, there is still respect of human rights internationally. So let me give you an example how the respect to human rights is playing out internationally. So you will see that whatever happens in East Central Europe is just, they jump on a bandwagon, then they go to the first seat. But what is happening there is secondary to the general problems of the demise of international human rights and national fundamental rights protection. So this is something from the UN. We have a general sponsor, and it has to do with the Office of the High Commissioner. There is bombardment in Syria. High Commissioner has a report, and they would like, and he wants to present it to the Security Council. The Security Council is not enthusiastic about that. This is a question of procedure, so there is no veto. The Russian representative is saying the following. Once again, bombarding people in Syria, major humanitarian crime, and I guess also violation of most of the things we know about international law and human rights. We do not see, here is the quote, we do not see any justification for this meeting discussing the report, since human rights is not a subject on the agenda of the Security Council. Now, you know very well that human rights protection is one of the goals of the Charter. So legally, this is nonsense. What happens? As I told you, this is a procedural issue, so it's no veto. This Russian position is not sufficient. And then, out of the 17 members, 9 members joined Russia and said that the report is of no interest to the Security Council. And to add, and that is also equally sad, no international media picked up on this. Only Reuters reported. No AP, no one else. So it was just something that people, the media, couldn't care. So this is the situation. It has reasons in international relations. The European Court of Human Rights is, for example, among other bodies, under increasing pressure coming from member states who don't want to execute judgments or are of the view that the court shall not deal with issues, period. That they should just perhaps find a violation when there is an obvious torture, and what is obvious torture they will determine, not the court. So that's really a telling sign. There are intellectual reasons for that. There's a new perception of human rights which replaces traditional respect for to all, with respect only to vulnerable groups. There is also a strong return to the idea that human rights cannot be universal, only local, so there are no universal standards. These processes went on for long, unfortunately, and now we see the results in a very new international context. So this is the international environment for human rights. It's not that human rights are officially declared dead or irrelevant, but the practical applicability is challenged, seriously challenged. And that's why I told you that this is not a very pleasant lecture in the sense of, okay, things are great, put some effort into these, learn 3 or more techniques, and you will get a perfect, just world. That's not the case. It's a world when all this is fundamentally challenged. And the challenge means that a certain level of cultural or civilizational standard is going to be thrown out. So that is what is at stake, and that's why this has to be taken seriously. So what is happening in East Central Europe? As I told you, the trick for the personal rule, for a liberal democracy, is to toy with the rule of law. You get rid of independent courts, and then you can apply whatever you like. So that's how you establish power. The human rights area is not important for the power holders. In fact, they realize that they have to allow a lot of freedom in the private sphere. So there they are very, very reluctant to interfere. It's not a return to communism or to totalitarian rule. Because, remember, there is a genuine need, although fully manipulated, to get the acclamation, the support of people. So you don't antagonize them. You want to go to the bar and have a party all night long? Okay, we will not stop it. It's not, again, not like in Soviet Union that you have to be at home and do your homework or sleep tight so that next morning you can go and do your dull work from 8 o'clock. Maybe in Georgia it started at 9, I don't know. So but it was dull for sure. So the moment when human rights and fundamental rights become an issue, when there is a growing oppression And because of growing oppression, at least for a while, there is growing resistance. And that concerns mostly political rights, demonstration, political organization, freedom of association, and sometimes freedom of religion. That's where you have points of conflict. That's where the political power needs total control, especially in freedom of speech. That's where there will be conflicts. So here you may expect, and indeed it happens, that there is an increasing restriction of human rights. I hope this is not going to that point, but we know certain big countries where this happens. So the last element where governments are changing human rights, and this is not again limited to illiberal democracy, or it is the illiberal element in established democracies. And this is related to a security scare. Rights are restricted in the name of protecting security. And how this is done is funny. It is done as if there were a right to security. So they invent a new right. Everyone has the right to live in security. And it is not social security, it's physical security. It's not physical security in the sense as it is in the Universal Declaration that you should be secure from police. You should be secure from terrorists who are 2,000 miles away, or you should be secure from migrants who are in technical terms, of course, asylum seekers. But they are called migrants because that's how you create enemies. And then you kick out all those guys, or you don't allow them to be there, or you create suspects who will be associated somehow with migrants, not to speak of terrorists. And then our people deserve security. They have the right to security, so we restrict rights. Right to assemble, right, and even privacy rights, wiretapping, etc., etc. So that's the trick. And that's going on. Again, it is not limited at all to East Central Europe, although the consequences might be much more tragic. Because then it is applied to all political, not necessarily opposition, but just people thinking differently. So that's where we are at the moment. I promised that I will not end on this rather sad note. Although I think that you have seen these bits and pieces here and there, but you know, to bring it together, that's very discouraging. And since I work on this, and we work on this in a way in Strasbourg as well, it's very, very unpleasant, I must say. Because you just see one problem after another. And what is the answer to that, right? I remember I taught, or I gave lectures first in the United States 30 or some years ago, and I am by nature pessimistic. And so it was a pretty pessimistic presentation or something or else. Here, it's not me who is pessimistic, it's just facts that I'm telling you. But it was very unpleasant. I felt that the audience was interested, but at the end they didn't like. So I cracked a few jokes, didn't have. So then someone told me, look, in America you cannot have a pessimistic lecture. You have to end on optimism. Here, I'm not trying to end on optimism because I try to accommodate the expectations of an American audience, because I think that some kind of optimism is absolutely needed. Otherwise, you help those who try to undermine liberal democracy. And not because liberals as such is of such a fundamental importance, or that constitution is valuable because it is based on certain fundamental liberal ideas of the 18th and 19th century. but because, as I try to explain, this is how you get you maintain a certain level of civilization. That is what is at stake. And if you admit that you pertain to a certain civilization, you act, you speak out, and you learn how to speak out. I think that's the first thing, to learn. And I hope that in this summer program, which is now at the 11th round, many people got that message, and I hope that this message will stay with you. Thank you very much.
Professor Shaios, thank you very, very much for this fascinating, very interesting lecture, for the possibility for us to engage in a critical thinking and to discuss the facts and the points which you raised. Actually, you said that it is a sad lecture, but actually you did give us a hope, because after all, if people, any illiberal power, democracy, needs legitimacy, and this legitimacy should come from the people. So unless and as far as these people have a possibility to influence the power, then we still have a hope. And I think it's a very important and very powerful message. Actually, you mentioned a couple of facts with respect to Hungary, Poland, Romania, and so on and so forth. And I recalled one high-profile Georgian politician who was responding to one of the questions from the audience, and he said that it's time to stop to refer to Georgia as a post-Soviet state, that we're not anymore post-Soviet, we are typical Eastern European state. He was right in a way, but now I understand he was completely correct. There are so many similarities with Eastern European countries we have, so it's very hard not to agree. It's time now for the questions. If there is anybody here wishing to raise a point or ask the questions, you have a chance. Please raise a hand, and we will come to you with a microphone.
Thank you very much for the fascinating lecture. And my first question is about how you understand the relationship between liberalism and democracy. Is it the one limiting the other, and would you understand the spread of illiberal democracy as democratization of those spheres which should not be touched by democratic principle? Would it be too a sharper formulation of your thesis? Or if not, so how do you treat the interrelation of these two? And the second is a more stranger one. It just came to me. Since you were mentioning those conceptions of the realities of the 20s of the last century, could we understand this a degradation of human rights as some cyclical phenomenon? So that which comes from time to time and then leads to terrible results and then leads us back to them in a way, and what could be the reason for that? So thank you very much.
I would like to respond right now, because these are rather crucial and complicated issues. So first, the relation between liberalism and democracy. So personally, I am a very early 19th century guy, and I would say yes. If I were to do things, then I would say yes. There is a sphere that is private, that is not for the state to enter. But I must say that this simply doesn't work in the contemporary situation. There are different expectations, very different power relations and dependencies. So ideal is not, I wouldn't say that what is ideal is unimportant, but it just doesn't work. So what is then the relation between liberalism and democracy? I started by saying that the problem of democracy is that democracy can be and is his own worst enemy. That it is democracy that can destroy itself internally. And there is very little one can do about that. But that very little that can be done is exactly what liberal constitutionalism is about. So, and that takes us also to this question that you refer to, that the people shall do something. Yes, but the problem is that in populism, people are taken as a whole, as a pack, and then they are manipulated, their mind are manipulated, and then they stand up as a homogeneous mass, as being placed in a certain situation by government. To be much more practical, the government, Brexit is the best example, I must say. So there was an issue, was emotionally manipulated. There was a process that was not thought through. They had only one referendum in history. The whole idea of British parliamentarism is the opposite of direct democracy. And then people who were emotionally manipulated were thrown into this dilemma, yes or no. That's not the answer to this problem. It was simply too complex. After 2 years, they still don't know what are the implications. So people have to find a form of structured self-representation. So to say that people are those who vote at a referendum is a mistake. And liberal constitutionalism is creating this kind of structures where human beings get into structured interaction. So it's not just like, a herd there are shepherd dogs around them, so you go in this direction, wah, 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 or you go in that direction, and they move in that direction. It's no interaction, right? Only through structured interaction that you construe a people. Otherwise, it's a mass, a multitude. And that's exactly what constitutional does, gives a structure. But a structure is a limit. So, yes, we talk about people's sovereignty or popular sovereignty, but that doesn't mean that this is unlimited. And these limits come from liberal democracy. You cannot have democracy otherwise, because otherwise it becomes self-destructive. So that's how I see the relation. Much more quickly on the second question, yes, it's true that there is a cyclical element, and although I think that human rights are universal and have to do with basic human condition, and that's true for 2,000 or 3,000 years, when this was not recognized in this form, or certainly not in legal form. There are cycles, but the fact that from a historical perspective there are cycles doesn't mean that human action shall be limited by that. Otherwise the cycle will not be a cycle. So there are external factors which may create the impression that this is of lesser importance, partly because people take this for granted. So they don't really, there are now these latest Pew surveys that the youngest generation in the United States, the most inclined to accept authoritarianism, because they simply have no idea what the opposite can be. So they have no imagination what a strong man's rule means. And to a lesser extent, that's probably true elsewhere. So again, this is part of the cycle. Another part of the cycle is, of course, a completely different geopolitical. But again, this is a historian's perspective, and we were judges, so we have a rather different perspective. And as far as I'm concerned, I was an activist, and I just couldn't accept that, okay, there is a cycle. So yes, it's the Communist Party is in rule. Okay, seem to be forever, but that's not a good enough reason not to believe in certain things.
You said that in liberal democracy as such, is a product of the abuse of some imperfection within the liberal democracy or liberal constitutionalism. What would you say, is there anything in the design of the so-called illiberal democracy that makes it equally self-destructive? So you said that, for example, in order to perpetuate themselves, they have to somehow reproduce this plebiscitary acclamation, legitimacy, and for this they have to allow some free spaces, some spheres of freedom, and they simply have to come to the terms that they cannot control all parts of society. Does this very fact create the hope that in these spheres of freedom that are left beyond the control, there can be formed some different culture of freedom that can create maybe a structured or not structured basis to undermine this cycle of reproduction of plebiscitary legitimacy?
It is hard to imagine that the weakness is that this type of rule is not capable of responding to unexpected crisis. That, contrary to a democracy. Democracy can mobilize much better. Here, if your only concern is to maintain power because that helps you either to achieve a certain ideological goal or a kleptocracy, that doesn't allow them to build up ordinary reserves. So if there is an emergency, just take most unpleasant version. If you buy from, and I use this as a hypothetical, nuclear power station from China, and you would like to steal the concrete from the construction, and then there is an earthquake. You can imagine the consequences. And this kind of shortcoming, and the Chinese will also steal another 1/3 of the concrete. Imagine what happens with an earthquake. I don't want that kind of event to bring down any liberal democracy, but you can see how vulnerable it can be. And it's also true, perhaps, politically, if they push too much for an ideological agenda, that may backfire. Or if there is an unexpected, sudden personal difficulty with the leader, so it becomes ill. The whole system may collapse. So there are built-in weaknesses in an illiberal democracy, but unfortunately that's not, the way I see, it's not at the level of okay, people coming to senses and they will change their mind and they will withdraw their support to the regime, because the mind control, that is very, very successful. Much more, by the way, than it was in the Soviet system, because of modern techniques of mind control.
მე სპეციალისტი ვარ, არ ვარ სფეროში, მაგრამ დიდი ხანია მაინტერესებს ეს სფერო და მენიშნა მისი წინადადება, რომ რეფერენდუმი არ არის მართებული ქმედება ზოგადად. მე აბსოლუტურად ვიზიარებ ამას, წავალ ცოტა შორს და შემდეგ შევეკითხები. კერძოდ თუ არის ამ მიმართულებით მუშაობა, საერთოდ მე ბევრს ადამიანს შევხვდი პოლიტოლოგს და ვერ მიპასუხეს ამის შესახებ. ის რომ არჩევნები დღევანდელი ფორმით ერთი ხმა, ერთი ამომრჩეველი თუნდაც არაკვალიფიციური, კომპეტენტური, არამედ არაკვალიფიციური არჩევნები, თუ არის ამის შეცვლაზე საერთოდ საუბარი და მუშაობა, თუ არის მუშაობა სოფლიოში, თუ იგონებენ ახალ პარადიგმას, რომელიც არ ეყრდნობა პარტიულ მართლობას. ზოგადად თუ არის განიხილება ისეთი მართლობა, ისეთი სისტემა, სადაც არ იქნება პარტია, რომელიც დღეს საჭირო საერთოდ აღარ არის, მისი იდეოლოგია აბსოლუტურად ატროფირებული არის. და თუ არის აი ეს კომპეტენტური არაერთი ერთზე ამომრჩეველი ესე იგი ხმა და ამომრჩეველი აი ამ სისტემაზე მუშაობა. თუ ამაზე არ არის აბსოლუტურად უსამართლო და ყოველთვის პოპულიზმზე იქნება დამყარებული მთელი მმართველობა. მადლობა.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be listening to you today. My question, I will try my best to articulate my question as best as I can. When we are talking about tendency towards illiberal democracy, as you have so coined, I don't have big of a concern from Western democracies where there is a huge tradition of constitutional law, protection of human rights, and general resistance towards such tendency, as I think was demonstrated in France election, for example. But however, when we're talking about these new emerging democracies in post-Soviet Union, for example, in Georgia, there is much more tendency towards authoritarianism and being emotionally manipulated by populists. My question would be, what advice would you give to states such as ourselves in order to avoid tendencies towards authoritarianism and illiberal democracies? Thank you.
პირველ რიგში მადლობა საინტერესო ლექციისთვის. ქართულად დავსვა მეც კითხვას. გარკვეულწილად ნახსენები იყო ეს პოლიტიკური პარტიების საკითხი. ჩემი ასე ვთქვათ კითხვა შეეხება, როცა ახსენეთ თქვენ პოპულიზმზე და რა თქმა უნდა ძალიან ბევრ სამეცნიერო ნაშრომს შევხვდებით ახლა რომ ესე ვთქვათ შესაბამისი პოპულისტური იდეებზე დაყრდნობილი პოლიტიკური პარტიების გავლენის ზრდაზე. ანუ ამ ნაწილს ხომ არ დააკავშირებდით თვითონ პარტიული სისტემებთან ან პარტიებთან, ხომ არ არის რაღაც ასე ვთქვათ გეფები, რომელსაც ვთქვათ არა პოპულისტური პოლიტიკური პარტიები ტოვებენ მოსახლეობაში, რასაც ასე ვთქვათ წარმატებით ითვისებს ეს პოპულისტური იდეები და იმავდროულად ამ ნაწილში რა ზოგადად ამ ნაწილისგან განსხვავებულად რა სტრუქტურულ პრობლემებზე შეიძლება ვისაუბროთ, როდესაც საუბრობთ ამ პოლიტიკური პარტიების პოპულისტური იდეოლოგიის მქონე პოლიტიკური პარტიების ზრდაზე. ანუ ხომ არ არის ამ კუთხით რაღაც გარკვეული კვლევები არის, მაგალითად ლათინურ ამერიკაზე საუბარი რომ ეკონომიკური საკითხები და ასე შემდეგ. ანუ თქვენ ამ ნაწილში თუ კი თვლით რომ რაღაცა უნიფიცირებულად, რა თქმა უნდა, ალბათ გამორიცხულია, მაგრამ კონტექსტური კომპონენტების გაერთიანებით ხომ არ შეიძლება აი ამ სტრუქტურული პრობლემების გამოკვეთა თუ რა იწვევს ამას. მადლობთ.
I would like to start with the second one on certainly even if I were more adverse in Georgian affairs, the last thing I would do is to pass judgment. I have a very different take. I just don't think that this approach that there are stable Western democracies and France and they will resist populism, and that's a different problem from post-communist countries or East European countries. That's exactly the problem. That's the new thing, that these are, in the contemporary world, extremely interrelated. Sure, Latin American populism has much longer history than populism in Europe. It was not that much party-based, so there are non-party-based populist movements, although formally there was a party even behind Perón in Argentina in 1950. But the real issue is that this is present, resonates, is imitated in stable democracies. And as I mentioned, I will not go into, I'm not going to become a geographer and give you a name of 30 countries which I could easily do and say that, okay, you have populism of a different stage in this and that country. There are enormous differences between illiberal democracies. Certainly Singapore, which is to some extent the inventor of illiberal democracy, is very different in economic terms, in cultural terms from Europe. But again, this is a quote from a Hungarian prime minister. He said that in our illiberal democracy, we have 5 model states, Singapore, Russia, Turkey, and he had some others. So it is interrelated, but it's a continuum. At the far end, you have autocracy and serious oppression. And there you already have the very serious problems of human rights. But the perpetuation of the power, the personal rule, these are common. And how you achieve that, of course, there are varieties. The Hungarian and Polish system at the moment, they use exactly the same techniques, but the goals officially are absolutely different. The Polish position is that they would like to have a moral renovation, and they have a different social policy. They just give people social welfare to maintain a base. In Hungary, that's not the case. In Hungary, they don't increase social welfare. Instead of that, they provide compulsory public work for the poorest, and if you don't vote the government, you don't get the public work, and then you get nothing. So the techniques are very different, and the goals are different. But the structure of government, the use of the state, perpetuation of power, in that respect, there are fundamental commonalities. So, and one more example, just to show that this is a continuum. It's not Eastern Europe cannot resist, or post-communist countries cannot resist. Take the Netherlands. The populist party, Geert Wilders, and the traditional, it's a big coalition, but you always have in Netherlands, but Rutte's party was neck to neck, right? Just 10 days before the election. Then Rutte, who was in power, did the following. The Turkish minister of something, a lady, wanted to have a campaign speech in the Netherlands to the Turkish community. And Rutte said, you can't do this. We don't allow you to do this. I think there's absolutely no legal basis for that. She was entitled to travel to the Netherlands. She had, all her papers were there. There was no public danger to ban her speech. It was banned. His car was stopped very spectacularly on the highway, or the convoy was stopped on the highway. That is clearly, to my mind, a problematic populist measure, just to win votes by this emotional manipulation that I stopped this Turkish Islamist, or allegedly Islamist thing. Not that I have much sympathy, but as a lawyer, I can't say that the content of her message is something that is a good ground to stop. She was not going to incite. She wanted to convince Turks in the Netherlands to vote Erdogan. They voted anyway, so it doesn't matter. So this shift, very spectacular shift, concession to populism, enabled them to win the elections because the 5% vote went to them from Geert Wilders' party. After that, the government policy in matters of migration moved exactly in the direction Wilders wanted them to go. Not that far, so they will say, if you ask Rutte, this is what we have to do to stop populists. But you stop populists by becoming at least half populist. Sure, half populist is better than full-baked populist, but you don't know when this half will become 2/3 and so on and so forth. So there is a shift, and I'm not making this up. Look at Italy. That's where it's stable, in a way, a stable democracy, certainly a culture of liberalism and democracy. And look where they are, with a super majority in parliament. So it is something that is going on everywhere. And I deliberately did not mention the United States, and I must say, in the United States, it was a miracle of 150 years since President Jackson that country never went into where it is today. Because all the conditions were there. Now, for some mysterious electoral, by the way, constitutional design problems, you can be a president of the United States with the minority of the votes. And that's what happened. And today the whole world is in a complete mess because of very different impulses coming from a group of people which is assumed to be the American people. They are certainly not. And that's really the problem. So I don't think that you should look at your own problems as local problems. It's part of a world conundrum. That's again not very encouraging, but that's how it works. And there is an incredible interaction. I mentioned the Poles deliberately study Hungarian legislation and copy it word by word. And Hungarians introduced laws which were well established in Russia 5 years earlier or 7 years earlier, into the law on NGOs, foreign agent. We all have it. And I guess Poland is looking at that. So it is a kind of self-accelerating process. Now, very quickly on the issue of parties or non-parties. Historically, there were no parties. Latin American populism is not party-based, it's movement-based or a charismatic leader-based. Brazil has a terrible electoral system which does not, they have parties in Brazil, but the party cannot control the candidate. The result is total mess. I'm not arguing in favor of parties. The German constitution believes, it's in the constitution, that parties are an essential part of democracy. There is a lot of disillusionment, that's true. Technically, it can be done, and as I mentioned, there are examples to that, so it's not something unheard of. But the historical development so far was that they moved away from non-party to party organizations. And that's the current situation. So yes, there are studies with direct democracy which believe that you can bypass that. It's not something unheard of. The historical trend today was to have parties. There is a general disillusionment with parties. But then you have a movement which then 2 years later, because of funding, becomes a party and behaves like a party. They may still call themselves a movement, but they will be a party. So it's very difficult to avoid the institutionalization of this. And as I say, I think I answered the difference in populism. Yes, that exists. Latin America is different, but then they try to perpetuate, and sometimes they fail. Is it economic? Even non-populist movements are about economic problems of the people, so you cannot assume that just because it's populist, it will be a better answer to economic concerns of the population. And this may be very political, but indeed, if you take Venezuela, Chavez first and then Maduro, they always promised that what we do, of course they never said that this is a manipulation of the constitution, but all the time they did that. We do it for the people and in order to solve the problems of the people. And the result is that the whole country is now totally devastated economically. So the promise that it will be socio-economic is just not a guarantee that people will be that better off. It's true that this is one of the techniques populists come to power. And in Latin America, they come to power since, I guess, a long time, but at least since 1950.
თქვენი ნებართვით მე მინდა კიდევ ერთხელ კითხვები აღარ არის, მე მგონი ისედაც მინდა დიდი მადლობა გადაუხადო პროფესორ შაიოს. I'm just concluding the public lectures. This part, let's say, of the the event, but we are not over. We are not over. We are still continuing. There is a very important part left. Just before inviting Rector Mr. Zdani again to the mic, I would like to thank you again and thank for your time and effort. You took quite a long trip to Tbilisi, to Georgia, and then you will go to Stepan Sminda, which is a beautiful place indeed. And you are doing that for the sake of and human rights and constitutionalism and education, and for the sake of the future and future generation of lawyers. And I really very much appreciate it. And thank you for all your efforts.
Great honor for me to say that for your outstanding contribution to the theory and practice of constitutional law, as well as for your contribution to training and educating several generations of Georgian lawyers, the Academic Council of this institution has decided to award you with the honorary doctorate of Ilia State University. So let's move to the table where